Think about the people history forgets. Not the ones who disappeared without a trace. Not the ones who never mattered. Think about the specific kind of forgetting that happens to people who were at the center of something enormous, who held it together through its most dangerous years, and who then got left behind when the story moved on without them. That kind of forgetting is not accidental. It tells you something about the story, about the people who survived to tell it, and about what gets lost when a movement grows beyond the world that produced it. This is a story about that kind of forgetting. It begins not in a gospel, not in a church. It begins in a single paragraph written by a man who had no reason to care. Jerusalem, the year 62 of the Common Era. The Roman governor Festus has just died. His replacement has not yet arrived from Rome. In the gap between one authority and the next, a man named Ananus sees his opening. Ananus is the high priest. He is described by the sources as bold. Some would say reckless, and not someone who waits when he can act. With no Roman governor in the city to check him, he convenes a council. He brings charges against a group of men. He hands down a sentence. The man at the center of those charges is named James. What happens immediately after is the detail that stops you. If you are paying attention, the people Josephus describes as the most fair-minded residents of Jerusalem, people who took the law seriously, people whose opinion carried genuine weight in the city. They are outraged. They are angry enough to send word to the incoming Roman governor before he even reaches the city. They want Ananus held accountable. Ananus is eventually removed from the high priesthood, partly because of the way he handled this. A Jewish historian named Josephus records all of it. He is writing for a Roman audience. He has no theological investment in James or in the community James led. He is not trying to build a case for anyone's holiness or anyone's authority. He is simply doing what careful historians do, which is record what happened. And in recording it, he pauses long enough to note that this particular death was considered profoundly unjust by people whose judgment mattered in Jerusalem. He identifies the man who died as James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. That phrase, written by someone outside the movement, written without any interest in making James into a saint or a symbol, is one of the earliest references to Jesus that survives in any non-Christian source we have, and it is not attached to Peter. It is not attached to Paul. It is attached to James. So, before anything else, before the Gospels, before the theology, before the long story of what happened to his memory, a question has to be asked. Who was this man? What had he done? And what had he become? That his death could move the most respected voices in Jerusalem to protest. What kind of person leaves that kind of mark? Not on believers who loved him, but on a city, on a historian, on a record that was never meant to honor him at all. To answer that, we have to go to the oldest surviving texts and ask something simple and uncomfortable. What do they actually say about James? Start with Paul. Not because Paul is the most sympathetic witness to James. He is not. But Paul is the earliest writer we have. His letters predate the Gospels as written documents by at least a decade, probably more. And when Paul mentions James, he does so without biography, without introduction, without any sense that he needs to establish who this person is before invoking his name. That absence of explanation is itself a piece of evidence. In his letter to the Galatians, written sometime in the late 40s of the first century, Paul describes a visit he made to Jerusalem roughly 3 years after his own transformation on the road to Damascus. He goes specifically to meet Peter. He stays 15 days. And during that visit, he writes, he saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. 4 words, the Lord's brother. No explanation attached. No footnote, no pause to establish credentials or clarify position. Paul writes it the way you write the name of someone your reader already knows. Someone whose authority does not need to be argued for, because it is already understood by everyone in the room. This is the earliest surviving Christian text in which James appears by name, and he appears not as someone being introduced to the story, not as a newcomer whose relevance needs to be established, but as someone whose presence in Jerusalem is simply assumed. Paul goes to Jerusalem, and he sees Peter, and he sees James. That is the sentence. James belongs in that sentence, the way a weight-bearing wall belongs in a building. You do not explain it. You build around it, because it is already there. Now move to the Gospels. Mark, the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels, records a scene that is easy to read quickly and harder to sit with once you have slowed down. Jesus is teaching. A crowd has gathered around him inside a house. Someone interrupts with a message from outside. Your mother and your brothers are here, asking for you. Jesus looks at the people sitting with him and asks a question back. Who is my mother? Who are my brothers? And then he answers it himself. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. The text does not tell us who was standing outside that day. It does not give us names. It does not tell us what the family felt when that answer made its way back to them, or whether it made its way back at all. It only records that the family came, that they were outside, and that Jesus responded in a way that drew a boundary between the people with him and the people who had come to find him. That is not a psychological portrait of James. It is something more minimal and more honest than that. It is a piece of text that holds attention without resolving it. It places the family of Jesus in a complicated position without explaining what that complication meant to any of them from the inside. John adds one more piece, and it is the most uncomfortable one. At a particular point in his account, John notes that Jesus' brothers were urging him to go to Jerusalem, to show himself publicly, to let the world see what he was doing. The urging has an edge to it in the Greek. It reads less like encouragement and more like a challenge. If you are really doing these things, go and let people see. And then John adds a line that stops the reader cold, for not even his brothers believed in him. One sentence, no elaboration, no explanation of what they did not believe, or why, or what belief would have even looked like from where they were standing. Just that note, placed in the narrative like a stone in shallow water, something you cannot step over without feeling it under your foot. And then something happens that none of the Gospels explain and none of them prepare you for. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, gives what scholars widely regard as one of the oldest surviving formulations of the resurrection tradition, a list of appearances that was probably already circulating orally before Paul ever committed it to writing. The list includes Peter. It includes the 12. It includes more than 500 people at once. And then, separately, with its own specific weight, Paul writes, then he appeared to James. Not James and the others. Not James among a group. James, individually, as someone whose encounter was significant enough to name on its own, in a list where most entries are collective. This is the man John said had not believed. This is the family member who stood outside while the crowd sat inside. And here he is. In the oldest resurrection tradition we have, named alongside Peter as someone to whom the risen Jesus appeared in a specific and personal way. The texts do not explain what happened between those 2 points. They do not give us the scene. They do not give us the conversation or the moment of recognition or whatever it was that moved James from one position to another. They only record where he was and then where he ended up, and leave the entire distance between those 2 places completely open. That open distance is not a failure of the record. It is the record. It is the most honest thing the texts have preserved about James, because it does not dress the gap in speculation or fill it with the kind of psychological reconstruction that feels satisfying and tells you nothing true. Something happened. James moved. The texts show you both ends and trust you to feel the weight of what is between them. Now, before we go any further into what James did, we have to acknowledge a question that is sitting in the middle of everything we have just looked at. A question about a single Greek word that seems simple and turned out to be anything but. Paul calls James the Lord's brother. He uses the word adelphos. In ordinary Greek, adelphos means a full sibling, a brother who shares both parents. That is the plain and primary meaning of the word, the meaning any Greek reader in the 1st century would have reached for first. But later, Christian tradition looked at that word and encountered a problem it could not leave alone. By the 4th century, the belief that Mary had remained a virgin throughout her entire life, not only at the moment of Jesus' birth but permanently afterward, had become theologically important to large portions of the Church. If Mary was perpetually virgin, she could not have had other children after Jesus, which meant that the people the texts called the brothers of Jesus had to be something other than what the word plainly said. We are going to come back to this, to what happened to that word, who changed it, and what the change cost, but not yet, because to understand why that question became so charged, so necessary to resolve, so worth centuries of argument, you first have to understand what James actually did with the authority that word implied. You have to understand what it meant that this man, the one at the edge of the texts, the one standing outside, the one who, according to John, had not believed, ended up at the center of the movement that his brother left behind. And to understand that, you have to go to Jerusalem. You have to go to the place where James stayed. Here is something the standard telling of early Christian history almost never says out loud. In the years immediately after the crucifixion, when the movement around Jesus was at its smallest and most vulnerable, when it was still a community of a few hundred people in a city that had just executed their leader, the man who held it together was not Peter, it was not Paul, it was not John or any of the others whose names appear most frequently in the tradition that followed. It was James. This is not a claim designed to diminish the others. Peter was essential. Paul was extraordinary. What they built across the Mediterranean world changed the course of human history in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. But Peter was in and out of Jerusalem, moving through the book of Acts like a man who belongs to the road as much as to any single place. Paul was planting communities across the Greek-speaking world. writing letters, arguing theology, traveling thousands of miles through territory that had never heard the name of Jesus. John fades from Acts so quietly that most readers do not notice the moment he stops appearing. James stayed, not because he had nowhere to go, not because he lacked the standing to be wanted elsewhere. He stayed because Jerusalem, in the first generation after Jesus, was not simply a city. It was the center of gravity for everything the movement understood itself to be. The temple was there. The memory was there. The community that had known Jesus in the flesh, that had heard him speak and watched him move through the world, was concentrated there, and James was there with it, year after year. Through the dangerous early years and the gradual growth and the increasing tension with Rome, decade after decade, holding the center while the world, the movement was reaching, expanded outward in every direction around him. In the first generation, Jerusalem was not just a location on a map. It was the place where authority gathered, where disputes came to be settled, where the legitimacy of what anyone else was doing in the wider world was ultimately measured. To hold Jerusalem was to hold something that could not be held from anywhere else. James understood this. Or rather, James did not need to understand it as a strategy, because it was simply the truth of the world he lived in. He was not staying in Jerusalem because he had calculated that staying was the best move. He was staying because Jerusalem was home, because the temple was the center of Jewish life and Jewish practice and Jewish hope, and because the movement he was leading had not yet become something that could exist without those things. Now look at what the sources actually show about the authority James held. Paul's letter to the Galatians is the most revealing document we have about the internal structure of the earliest Christian community. And it is revealing precisely because Paul is arguing in it. People who are arguing let things slip that more careful writers conceal. Paul is defending his own apostleship and his own version of the gospel against challenges from people who question whether he received it correctly. He is writing with heat, and in the course of that heated defense, he describes his relationship to Jerusalem in a way that shows us exactly where power actually resided in the movement he was part of. He visits Jerusalem 3 years after his transformation. He sees Peter and James. 14 years later, he goes back. This time he brings Barnabas. He brings Titus. He goes, as he writes, in response to a revelation, and he lays before the leaders there the gospel he has been preaching, to make sure he has not been running in vain. That phrase, running in vain, is worth pausing on. This is Paul, who has described his apostleship as equal to anyone's, who has said he received his gospel not from human beings, but directly, who is not in the habit of deferring to authority he does not recognize as genuine. And even Paul, in this moment, goes to Jerusalem to have his gospel confirmed. He names the people he meets with. He calls them the pillars. The word is architectural. Pillars are the things that hold a structure standing. Remove them, and everything falls. And the 3 pillars he names are James, Peter, and John. James is listed first. This is not a small detail buried in a footnote. This is Paul, in his own letter, written to defend his own authority, naming James before Peter, the man who did not travel, who did not plant churches across the empire, who stayed in Jerusalem, is named first among the pillars by the man who traveled more than anyone. The book of Acts. written later than Paul's letters, and broadly sympathetic to Peter's role in the early movement, cannot avoid James when the story reaches its most consequential moment. The Jerusalem Council. This is the gathering where the question that would define the entire future of the movement had to be answered. Gentiles had been joining in significant numbers. The community had to decide whether those Gentiles needed to be circumcised and take on the requirements of the Mosaic law in order to fully belong. It was not a theoretical question. It had immediate consequences for every community in the movement. For who could eat with whom? For who was recognized as fully inside and who was treated as something adjacent? Peter speaks at the council. Paul and Barnabas present what they have witnessed among the Gentiles. There is significant debate. Multiple voices are heard. And then James speaks. What Acts records next is not more debate. It is not a vote. The letter that goes out from Jerusalem to the Gentile communities reflects the position James has just articulated, with the specific language James used. Under the authority of James's name, he speaks, and the matter is settled. Acts does not pause to comment on this. It does not note that James has just functioned as the final word on the most important theological question of the first generation. It records it the way you record something that was obvious to everyone in the room. You do not explain what no one present needs explained. I want to say something here that I have been circling around since the beginning of this chapter, because I think it needs to be said plainly. Most people who grew up anywhere near Christianity know Peter as the rock on which the church was built. They know Paul as the great apostle to the Gentiles, the man whose letters fill more than a third of the New Testament, the missionary who carried the message from Jerusalem to Rome. James, if they know him at all, is a peripheral figure. Maybe the author of a short letter in the back of the Bible, maybe the brother of Jesus, or maybe a cousin, depending on what tradition they were raised in. Someone the story mentions occasionally and then moves past. But the oldest texts we have, the ones written by Paul himself within 20 years of the crucifixion, tell a different story about who actually had to be reckoned with. They tell a story in which James is named before Peter among the pillars, in which Paul's second visit to Jerusalem is structured around gaining recognition from the leadership there. And James is part of that leadership, in which the movement's most important early decision is effectively closed when James speaks. That gap between the James the earliest sources describe and the James most people have inherited did not happen by accident. It is the result of something real, something that has to do with what was lost and what survived, with which communities kept writing and which communities stopped existing, with the particular way that history gets told when the people who tell it are the ones who made it to the other side. Others carried the message outward. James stayed where it began, and for a generation, where it began was where the movement's authority actually lived, where its disputes were settled, where the memory of Jesus was still held by people who had known him not as a theological proposition, but as a person who walked and ate and argued and told stories in the actual world. Jerusalem was not background to the story of early Christianity. For the generation James led, Jerusalem was the story, and James was its keeper, which means that what happened to James, and what happened to Jerusalem, and what happened to the relationship between those two losses, is not a footnote to the history of early Christianity. It is the history that the history we know was built on top of. Imagine you are part of a movement that began entirely inside one people, one tradition, one set of practices and texts and ways of understanding the world that had been built and refined over centuries. And then, faster than anyone anticipated, people from outside that world begin joining, not in ones and twos, in numbers that cannot be ignored. They believe the message. They want to belong. They are coming through the door before anyone has decided what the door is supposed to look like. And suddenly the movement has to answer a question it was never designed to answer. Who counts as fully inside? This is not an abstract theological puzzle sitting comfortably in a seminar room. It has consequences that play out every single day, in the most ordinary and intimate moments of community life. Who can eat at the same table? Who participates in the same rituals? Whose home can you enter and eat the food that is served there? Who is recognized as fully part of the body, and who is treated as something adjacent to it? Welcome, but not quite the same. These are questions about belonging, and questions about belonging cut to the place in people where identity and faith and daily life are not three separate things, but one. For the earliest followers of Jesus, all of whom were Jewish, the question arrived in a specific and unavoidable form. Did Gentiles who believed in Jesus need to be circumcised? Did they need to take on the requirements of the Mosaic law, the dietary regulations, the Sabbath observance, the full framework of practice that had defined Jewish life and Jewish identity for generations? Did they need to become Jews in order to fully belong to the people of Israel's Messiah? Paul said no, and his no was not quiet or diplomatic or hedged with careful qualifications. Paul argued, with enormous energy and across multiple letters to multiple communities over many years, that Gentiles did not need to be circumcised or take on the requirements of the Mosaic law in order to belong to the Messiah's people. What was required was faith. The Gentiles could come in as Gentiles. The law, for Paul, had served its purpose. Something new had arrived that changed what belonging meant. James held a position that was more complex than a simple opposite of Paul's. And it is important to resist the temptation to flatten him into a cartoon conservative standing in the doorway trying to keep people out. The evidence does not support that portrait, and it is not honest to the man. What the evidence suggests is something like this. James accepted that Gentiles could join the movement. The letter that goes out from the Jerusalem Council in his name does not require circumcision of Gentile believers. He is not drawing a line that says Gentiles cannot enter. What James held, as far as the surviving sources allow us to see, was a different kind of boundary. Jewish followers of Jesus should continue living as Jews. Torah observance for Jewish believers was not, for James, something the new movement superseded or rendered optional. It was something the new movement continued, because the new movement had grown out of Israel and was still, in James's understanding, a movement within Israel. This distinction matters more than it might seem at first. James was not trying to stop the movement from growing. He was trying to keep it from becoming something entirely disconnected from what it had come from. He was holding a position that made complete internal sense, given who he was and where he stood. He was a Jew in Jerusalem, leading a community of Jews, in a world where the temple still stood at the center of daily religious life, where the rhythms of Jewish practice were the rhythms of the year and the week and the day. For James, following Jesus and keeping Torah were not in tension. They had never been in tension. The question of whether they needed to be in tension was a question that came from somewhere else. From the Greek-speaking Gentile world that Paul was building in. Not from Jerusalem. Now, I want to be honest about something. Because this chapter is the one where intellectual honesty is both most important and most difficult to sustain. I find Paul easier to follow than James. Not because I think he was more right, but because his voice is the one that survived in a form I can actually read. His letters are the documents we have. His arguments have been engaged and refined and argued over for 2,000 years. His framework is the one through which Western Christianity learned to explain itself. The one that shaped the language of the tradition. The one that feels familiar in a way that James's position, which has to be reconstructed from sources that were not sympathetic to it, simply does not. Easier to follow is not the same as more correct. And the more carefully I read what Paul writes about his encounters in Jerusalem, the more I notice something that is easy to miss when you are moving quickly through the text. Paul is arguing very hard, harder than someone argues when the opposition is obviously wrong. He is defending himself, his gospel, his authority, against a challenge that is serious enough to require serious response across multiple letters over multiple years. And the challenge is coming from people connected to Jerusalem, connected to James. That does not make James right, but it makes the argument less settled than Paul's surviving voice would suggest. Paul won in the sense that matters historically. His letters have survived, and James's did not. His communities spread across the empire, and James's community was destroyed along with Jerusalem. His framework became the framework that the church that shaped the Western world built on. But winning an argument historically is not the same as ending it. The argument Paul was having did not disappear when Jerusalem fell. It just lost one of its voices. There is a scene in Galatians that deserves to be slowed down considerably, because it is usually read quickly and its full weight tends to get lost in the reading. Paul is in Antioch. He and Peter are eating together, sharing meals with Gentile believers. The table is mixed. Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus eating the same food in the same room. And Peter is fully present to it. And then certain people arrive. Paul describes them as coming from James. They have come from Jerusalem. And when they arrive, Peter withdraws. He stops eating with the Gentiles. He separates himself. The other Jewish believers in Antioch follow his lead. Even Barnabas, Paul writes, was carried along in what Paul calls the hypocrisy. Paul confronts Peter to his face, in front of everyone. This scene is almost always read as Paul being admirably bold and Peter being inconsistently weak. That reading is not wrong, but there is another layer that the standard reading tends to move past. Peter's behavior changes specifically when people connected to James arrive from Jerusalem, which means the expectation those people carried with them, the expectation about table fellowship, about who eats with whom, was different from what Peter had been doing in Antioch, which means that the question was not settled, not by the Jerusalem Council, not by anyone. It was alive, and it was contested, and it ran like a live wire through the entire movement. James was at one end of that wire. Paul calls Peter's behavior hypocrisy. That is a sharp word, and Paul means it sharply. But notice the thing Paul does not say. He does not say the concerns that came from Jerusalem were groundless. He does not dismiss the question of Jewish practice as irrelevant. He argues against the specific consequence of those concerns for Gentile inclusion. but the underlying concern itself. The question of what it means for a Jewish movement to open itself to the nations without losing what it was. That question Paul addresses but never fully resolves, because it could not be fully resolved by argument. It could only be resolved by time and by the events that history was already preparing. James did not need to construct a theological argument for why Jewish practice mattered. He lived inside it. Jerusalem was not an idea for James. It was the ground under his feet. The temple on the hill above the city. The prayers at specific hours of the day. The rhythms of Sabbath and festival and fast that organized time itself. For James, asking whether Jewish followers of Jesus needed to keep Torah was like asking whether a river needed to keep flowing in the direction gravity pulled it. The question made sense from somewhere else, from inside the world James inhabited. It was not really a question at all, but the world James inhabited was running out of time. The year 70 was coming, and when it arrived, it would not just destroy a city, it would destroy the conditions that made James's position possible. It would remove from the conversation the community that had been living the answer he was giving, and the Christianity that survived on the other side of that destruction would be built almost entirely from the pieces Paul had put in place. In cities, far from Jerusalem, among people for whom the temple had always been an idea rather than a place you could walk to. Before that happens, there is one more thing we have to understand about James. We have to understand what he looked like to the people who were actually there, not the scholars looking back, not the theologians deciding what his position meant. The people of Jerusalem, who walked the same streets he walked, who knew him not as a historical problem to be solved, but as a person who was present in their city every day. What did they see when they saw James? That question has an answer, a strange one that does not look like anything later Christianity would have invented on its own. There is a kind of historical evidence that does not arrive in the form of dates and verified documents. It arrives in the form of a portrait, not a painting, a shape. The shape a person takes in the memory of the people who knew them, carried forward in the stories a community tells about someone long after that person is gone. This kind of evidence cannot tell you exactly what was said on a specific afternoon in a specific room. It cannot give you the transcript, but it can tell you something almost as valuable. It can tell you what a person meant, what they stood for in the understanding of the people who were still living inside the world that person had helped hold together. For James, that portrait comes primarily from a writer named Hegesippus. Hegesippus wrote in the 2nd century. His original works have not survived intact. What we have are substantial passages preserved by Eusebius, the 4th century church historian who recognized that Hegesippus was carrying something worth keeping before it disappeared entirely. The portrait Hegesippus draws of James is unlike anything else in the early Christian record. It is specific in ways that general idealization rarely is. It is strange in ways that invention tends not to be. And its strangeness is precisely what makes it worth taking seriously. James, according to Hegesippus, drank no wine and ate no meat. He used no oil when he bathed. He wore no wool, only linen against his skin. He entered the temple to pray so frequently, kneeling on the stone floor with his face toward the ground in intercession for the people, that the skin of his knees had become hardened and calloused, like the knees of a camel. Hegesippus says, that is the image he reaches for. not the knees of a penitent or a monk or a man performing a religious duty. The knees of an animal that carries weight across long distances without stopping. The people of Jerusalem called him James the Just. They gave him another name as well, and Hegesippus preserves it. Oblius. He explains this title as meaning something like the bulwark of the people, the rampart, the thing that stands between the city and what would come against it. Sit with that for a moment. Not the Christians of Jerusalem calling him that. The people of Jerusalem, a city that was not uniformly Christian. A city where most residents did not share the specific belief that Jesus was the Messiah. A city full of competing religious authorities and priestly families and ordinary people trying to live their lives inside a world that was increasingly pressured from every direction. That city looked at James and saw someone they recognized as righteous. Someone whose presence in the city meant something to them that went beyond the boundaries of any particular theological position. They gave him a title that said, "This man is what stands between us and collapse." That is not what you say about a footnote. Now, before we go further into what Hegesippus shows us, I want to say something about how to read him, because how you read him determines how much weight you give to what follows. Hegesippus is not a journalist with a recorder. He is not giving us a transcript of events he personally witnessed. He is writing in the 2nd century about a man who died in 62, drawing on traditions that had already been shaped by decades of community memory, of telling and retelling, of the natural and very human tendency to make the people we have lost into the fullest and clearest version of what they represented to us. The portrait he draws of James has almost certainly been idealized in the transmission. The specific details, the camel knees, the linen clothing, the constant presence in the temple. These are the details of holiness as a community remembers it, which is not always the same thing as holiness exactly as it was lived, in all its ordinary and complicated dailiness. Hegesippus is not giving us James as a modern historian armed with primary sources would reconstruct him. He is giving us the shape James had taken in early Christian memory by the time Hegesippus was writing. And that shape is what matters here, not as a photograph of the man, as a record of what the man meant to the people who carried his memory forward. And the shape is striking precisely because of what it does not look like. It does not look like a bishop in the Latin tradition. It does not look like the kind of institutional authority that the churches in Rome and Antioch and Carthage were building toward, where authority was expressed through hierarchy and formal office and the chain of succession that connected each leader to the leaders before him. The James that Hegesippus remembers does not derive his weight from his position in an institution. He derives it from something older and less organized than that, from personal holiness that a city can see with its own eyes, from prayer that leaves its mark on a body, from a presence that people recognize as genuine without needing it to be explained to them. He looks, if I am being completely honest, more like a figure from the world of the Hebrew prophets than like any church leader most modern people would recognize. A man defined not by his office but by his practice, by what he did with his body every day, in the temple, on the stone floor, in the prayers that were not performed for an audience, but that became visible anyway, because you cannot pray that much without the evidence showing up eventually in your knees. And he was recognized as such, not only by the people who believed what he believed, but by the broader city around him, That last detail is the one I find most difficult to move past quickly. James the Just, Oblius, given those names not by his own community, not by people who were already convinced, but by a city, by Jerusalem, a city that had seen holy men before, that had its own traditions and its own standards for what righteousness looked like, that was not easily impressed by someone simply claiming a connection to something sacred. That city looked at James and named him. James did not need to make Jesus Jewish. For James, Jesus had never been anything else. This is the sentence I keep returning to when I try to understand what James represented and why his memory created such difficulties for the tradition that came after him. Paul built a theology that could travel. It could move through Greek cities and Roman trade routes and Gentile households because it had been translated, not just into different languages, but into different conceptual frameworks, into a form that the wider Mediterranean world could receive without first becoming something it had never been. That translation was necessary. It was probably inevitable. And in the long view of history it was, by almost any measure, remarkably successful. But translation always costs something. When you carry a thing from one world into another, something stays behind at the border, not through anyone's fault or deliberate choice, simply because some things are native to a particular soil and do not survive the crossing into a different climate. What stayed behind? In the movement from Jewish Jerusalem to Gentile Rome, from temple-centered practice to creedal theology, from the community James held together to the communities Paul built across the empire, was the world James lived in, the world in which following the Messiah and keeping Torah were not competing loyalties but expressions of the same loyalty, the world in which the temple was not a symbol of something the new faith had superseded, but the living and breathing center of a living and breathing faith, the world in which Jesus was not a departure from Israel, but Israel's deepest hope, arriving in a form that was both familiar and shattering. James did not fight to preserve that world. He lived inside it, the way you live inside your first language. You do not defend it against other languages because you are not primarily thinking of it as a language at all. It is the medium you move through, the thing you think in before you think about anything else. Hegesippus records one more thing about James that I cannot pass over without stopping. He says that James was so recognized as the righteous center of Jerusalem, so understood as the thing that was holding something together in that city, that some in the tradition believed his death was connected to what followed, that Jerusalem lost its protection when it lost James, that the catastrophe of 70, the Roman siege, the burning of the temple, the destruction of everything, was in some way the consequence of removing the one who had been standing between the city and disaster. This is not history in any modern sense of the word. It is theology dressed as history. The meaning-making of a community trying to understand a catastrophe so complete that ordinary explanations could not reach it. You do not explain the end of your world with ordinary explanations. You reach for something that has the same scale as the loss. But it tells us something important that has nothing to do with its literal truth. It tells us that the people who carried James's memory experienced his death and the fall of Jerusalem as part of the same event, not as coincidence, as connection, as the loss of a world rather than the loss of a man. You do not remember a peripheral figure that way. You remember a center that way, something that was holding things together, something whose absence you felt not as grief for a person, but as a change in the structure of the world you were living in. And 8 years after James died, the structure of that world did change. permanently, in ways that no one inside it could have fully anticipated. Which brings us to a question that has been waiting since the beginning of this story. If James was that central, if Jerusalem held him in that kind of regard, if even Paul named him first among the pillars, then why did the tradition find him so difficult to carry cleanly into the centuries that followed? The answer lives in a single Greek word, a word that Jerome, in the 4th century, decided needed to mean something other than what it said. Jerome is one of the most learned men the early church produced. This is not flattery offered to soften what comes next. It is a fact that makes what happened with James more interesting and more worth thinking about carefully. Because what Jerome did was not the work of an ignorant person or a careless one. It was the work of someone who understood exactly what was at stake and made a deliberate and considered choice about how to handle it. Understanding that choice, and understanding why it was made, tells us more about what happened to James's memory than almost anything else in this story. In the late 4th century, Jerome undertook the translation of the Bible into Latin. The result, known eventually as the Vulgate, became the authoritative scriptural text of the Western Church for more than 1,000 years. When ordinary Christians in medieval Europe encountered the words of Scripture, they encountered them in Jerome's Latin. When theologians argued about what a passage meant, they argued about Jerome's Latin. When a priest read from the Bible at a Mass, the congregation heard Jerome's Latin. The translation was not simply a text. It was the lens through which an entire civilization read the story it had organized itself around. The weight of that is difficult to overstate. And Jerome had a problem. The problem was a word, the Greek word adelphos, brother. The word Paul had used without explanation in his letter to the Galatians when he wrote that he had seen James, the Lord's brother. The word the Gospels used when they referred to the brothers of Jesus appearing at the edge of his ministry, asking for him, not believing him, urging him toward Jerusalem. In Standard Greek, adelphos means a full biological sibling, a person who shares both parents with you. That is the plain and primary meaning of the word. The meaning any Greek reader in the 1st century would have understood without needing to be told. But by Jerome's time, the belief that Mary had remained a virgin not only at the moment of Jesus' birth, but throughout her entire life, had become theologically significant to a substantial portion of the church. This was not a peripheral concern. The perpetual virginity of Mary was becoming part of how the Western Church understood the nature of Jesus, the nature of holiness, and the nature of what it meant for God to enter the world in the specific way Christians believed God had entered it. And if Mary was perpetually virgin, she could not have had other children after Jesus, which meant that the people the texts called the brothers of Jesus could not be what the word plainly appeared to say they were. Jerome argued his way to a solution. He pointed out, and he was not wrong about this, that in the tradition of Hebrew and Aramaic usage, words for kinship were often used more broadly than their Greek equivalents. In the Hebrew scriptures, the word that gets translated as brother is sometimes used for relationships we would call cousin, or kinsman, or simply close relative. Jerome's conclusion was that the brothers of Jesus in the gospel texts were in fact cousins, relatives of some kind, kin in the wider Semitic sense of the word, rather than siblings in the full biological sense. The linguistic argument is not invented from nothing. It has real substance. Scholars continue to debate its implications for how the gospel texts should be read. And honest scholarship has to acknowledge that the question is genuinely complex. But Jerome was not the only tradition that had wrestled with this problem, and it matters to say so clearly. In the Eastern Church, a different solution had already been developed. Older than Jerome's, and with its own internal logic, this tradition, associated with a writer named Epiphanius of Salamis, held that the brothers of Jesus were the children of Joseph from a marriage before he wed Mary. Joseph was a widower. He had children from that earlier life. When he married Mary, those children became part of the household, and they were the people the Gospels called the brothers and sisters of Jesus. Not Mary's children, Joseph's stepbrothers and stepsisters in the household, half-siblings in the extended sense, but not children born to Mary after Jesus. Two traditions, two different solutions to the same underlying problem. The Eastern Church saw the brothers as stepchildren of Joseph. The Western Church, following Jerome, saw them as cousins. Neither tradition required what the plain Greek word said they were. What neither tradition paused to fully ask was the question underneath the question. Not what the brothers of Jesus needed to be for the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity to hold, but what it would mean, for James specifically, if the word meant what it plainly said, what it would mean to be a full brother of the man who became the center of a world religion, to have grown up in the same house, at the same table, through the same ordinary years of childhood and early life, before any of it had the shape it later acquired, to have known Jesus before anyone called him Christ, to have argued with him, perhaps the way brothers argue, to have watched him become something that neither of you could have predicted and that neither of you had a map for. A full brother of Jesus carries a kind of intimacy with the story that no other category allows. A cousin can be a follower, a believer, someone who encountered the movement and recognized something true in it. A cousin's relationship to Jesus is mediated by belief, by decision, by the choice to follow. A full brother's relationship is prior to all of that. It is simply there, built into the structure of a shared life, before any of the questions that would define the movement had even been asked. That kind of intimacy is harder to manage in a tradition that has organized itself around specific understandings of who Jesus was and how he came into the world. A full brother asks questions that a cousin does not, questions about the household in Nazareth, about what it was like to be in that family, about what Mary was and what Joseph was, and what ordinary life looked like before the story became the story that reshaped the world. Those questions are not comfortable. They are not easily assimilated into the theological frameworks that had developed by Jerome's time. And so the word that contained them was translated into something the story could carry more smoothly. Not erased. Translated into something the tradition could hold without the full weight of what a brother actually means pressing against the seams. Jerome finished his translation. The Vulgate went into the world. For more than 1,000 years, the Western Church read the word that Paul had written, the Lord's brother, through the lens of Jerome's decision. The cousin's reading became so thoroughly embedded in Western Christian understanding that for most of that period, it was not experienced as an interpretation at all. It was simply what the text said. James remained in the texts. He remained in the letter that carries his name, in the references that dot the book of Acts, in the brief but significant appearances in Paul's letters. He was never removed. The tradition did not try to pretend he had not existed, but the word that had once placed him closest to the center of the story, the word that connected him to Jesus in the most immediate and irreducible way possible, had been quietly moved into a different register. And when a word moves, something moves with it. Not the fact of James, something subtler and harder to name, the weight of his proximity, the specific gravity of what it means to have been that close to where everything began. And then, 8 years after James died, the city where he had spent his life was gone. The temple burned in the year 70. The community that had gathered around James, the Jewish followers of Jesus centered in Jerusalem, scattered. The center that James had spent 30 years holding did not survive his death by long. The Christianity that grew and spread and shaped the centuries that followed was built from the pieces that had already been carried outward, into the Greek-speaking cities, along the Roman roads, into the Gentile communities Paul had planted far from the place where everything had started. That Christianity remembered Peter. It remembered Paul. James, it remembered in the form that the story found it easiest to carry. A cousin rather than a brother. A writer of a useful letter rather than the pillar named before Peter. A figure at the edge of the tradition rather than the man who held its center for a generation. The word had changed, and the man, in some important way, had changed with it. Go back to Jerusalem. Go back to the year 62, to the paragraph in Josephus that opened this story. You have read it before. You know what it says. Ananus convenes a council. James is brought before it. He is condemned. He is killed. The most fair-minded people in the city protest. The incoming Roman governor is angered. Ananus loses his position. Read it again now. The words are the same. The sentences are the same. The spare, non-theological language of a historian, recording events for an audience that has no particular investment in any of the people involved, has not changed by a single syllable. Josephus is still doing what Josephus does, which is observe and record and move on, without pausing to assign meaning or draw lessons or tell the reader how to feel. But you are not the same reader you were at the beginning. You know now that the man Ananus moved against was not a minor community leader in a city full of competing religious factions. You know that Paul named him first among the pillars of the movement, before Peter, before John. In a letter Paul wrote to defend his own authority. You know that James presided over the most consequential decision the earliest Christian community ever made, and that the decision was effectively closed when James spoke. You know that Jerusalem called him the just, called him the bulwark, gave him titles that cities do not give to people whose absence would not be felt. You know that his knees told the story of what he had given to the prayers that defined his daily life. When Ananus moves against James, you understand now what is actually being moved against. Not a man, a center. The historians who have looked most carefully at this moment tend to read Ananus's motivation as political. The gap between governors was an opportunity, and Ananus was someone who recognized opportunities. James led a community that had been growing in influence and visibility in Jerusalem for 3 decades. The charges of violating the law were the available legal mechanism for doing what Ananus wanted to do, which was to act while he could. That reading is probably right, as far as it goes. But there is something else in the timing that I find myself returning to. Something that the political reading does not fully account for. James had been in Jerusalem for 30 years. He had been the recognized leader of his community for most of that time. He had negotiated the complicated terrain of a city under Roman occupation, a city with its own internal religious politics, a city full of factions and pressures and competing claims on what it meant to be faithful. He had done all of this while maintaining the respect, according to both Josephus and Hegesippus, of people who did not share his beliefs. That is not an easy thing to sustain for 30 years. That is the work of someone who understood the world he was living in and had figured out how to remain inside it without losing what he was. And then Ananus decides that now is the moment, 8 years before Jerusalem falls. I am not suggesting a causal connection in any literal sense. History is not arranged that neatly, and the traditions that did suggest such a connection were doing theology, not history. But I am saying that the timing sits there in the record and does not let you move past it without feeling something. James died, holding the center of a world that was 8 years away from ceasing to exist. The community he led, the Jewish Christianity of Jerusalem, did not survive the destruction of the temple as a coherent and continuing force. It scattered. Some went across the Jordan. Others dissolved into the wider Jewish diaspora. The particular form of faith James had spent his life sustaining, rooted in Jerusalem, rooted in the temple, rooted in the daily practice of a Jewish life, lived in the place where Jewish life had its deepest roots. That form of faith did not make it through the year 70 in any form that could carry forward independently. What made it through was what Paul had built, and what Paul had built was located somewhere else entirely. The communities Paul planted were in Corinth and Ephesus and Philippi and Rome. They were Greek-speaking. They were majority Gentile. They did not depend on Jerusalem for their existence or their legitimacy in any practical sense, because Paul had spent his ministry arguing, very successfully, that they did not need to. They had their own letters from Paul. They had their own leadership. They had their own way of understanding what the movement was and what it was for, a way that did not require the temple to be standing or Jerusalem to be intact. When Jerusalem fell, those communities lost a symbolic center. They did not lose a functional one. They kept going. They grew. They produced the texts and the arguments and the institutional structures that became what we recognize as Christianity. And in their memory, in the story they told about where they had come from and what the movement was, James occupied a complicated position. He was in the texts. He could not be removed from the texts because Paul had written about him and the book of Acts had recorded him, and those documents were already circulating and already considered authoritative. But he was in the texts as a problem that had to be managed rather than a center that had to be honored. He was the pillar named first by Paul, who ended up third or fourth in popular memory. He was the leader of Jerusalem who became a footnote to the people who had left Jerusalem. He was the Lord's brother who became a cousin when a cousin fit better into the story the tradition needed to tell about Mary and about Jesus and about how God had entered the world. He was not forgotten. He was remembered in the shape the surviving tradition found it most convenient to give him. Now I want to leave you with 3 questions. Not because I have been saving the answers for a dramatic reveal at the end. I have no answers to give you. These are questions that do not have answers that any amount of scholarship or any length of reflection has managed to close. They are the kind of questions that stay open, that work on you after you have stopped actively thinking about them, that come back in unexpected moments and ask to be sat with again. The first question: if James was the settled authority in Jerusalem, if Paul named him first among the pillars, if the book of Acts records the most consequential early decision of the movement being effectively closed when James spoke, what does that ask us to reconsider about the story many people inherited? The story where Peter and Paul stand in the foreground and James stands somewhere behind them, mentioned occasionally, explained carefully, remembered as secondary to the people who traveled farther and wrote more, and whose names ended up on more churches. This is not a question designed to reduce Peter or Paul. What they did was real, and its consequences were enormous. But when a story moves from one world into another, something gets carried and something gets left at the border. The question is whether we are willing to look at what was left, not to judge the people who made the crossing, but to understand what the crossing actually cost. The second question: James survives most clearly in the sources that were not trying to build what Christianity became. He survives in Josephus, who was a Jewish historian writing for Romans and had no investment whatsoever in making James into a saint or a symbol or a useful figure for any theological argument. He survives in Hegesippus, who was remembering a Jerusalem that had ceased to exist by the time he was writing, preserving a portrait that served no obvious institutional purpose, and that looks nothing like the leaders the surviving church was producing in his own time. He survives at the margins, in the places where the tradition's need to shape its own memory was weakest and the older material had the most room to breathe. What does it mean that our clearest picture of James comes from people who were not trying to serve the story that won? That question does not resolve into a simple answer about conspiracy or institutional failure or deliberate suppression. It resolves into something quieter and more unsettling. It resolves into a question about how memory works when a movement grows beyond the world that produced it. About what happens to the people who stayed in that world when the people who left begin to write the history. About whether a tradition can look honestly at the gap between the people it chose to remember and the people who were actually there, without that honesty requiring it to tear down everything it built on the way out. The third question, this is the one I find hardest. Jerusalem fell in the year 70. The temple burned. The world James had given his life to, the world of Jewish practice and temple prayer, and the specific geography of a city that understood itself as the place where the sacred and the ordinary met every day. That world did not come back. What replaced it? As the center of Christian life and memory and institutional authority was Rome. And what replaced the Jewish movement James had led was something genuinely and powerfully new. Something that had translated itself so completely into a different world that its origins in the first one had become difficult to see clearly. What would Christianity have become if Jerusalem had not fallen? If the community James led had survived? Not as a footnote absorbed into a Gentile church that had already moved past it, but as a continuing and living center. If the movement had maintained a heart that was still Jewish, still temple-oriented, still shaped by the rhythms of practice and the geography of the city where it began. We cannot know. The history went the way it went, and counterfactual history is always closer to imagination than to scholarship. I know that, but I keep asking it anyway. Not because I think the outcome would necessarily have been better, Not because I am romanticizing a lost world or suggesting that what Paul built was a mistake, but because the question does something that I think is worth doing. It restores weight to what was actually lost. It refuses to treat the fall of Jerusalem and the disappearance of Jewish Christianity as simply the natural and inevitable tide of history, as if what survived was always destined to survive, and what was lost was never really load-bearing. James was load-bearing. To the people who called him the bulwark, to the city that gave him that name, to the tradition that kept fragments of his memory alive in texts that were never quite sure what to do with him. And are we allowed to grieve the Christianity that might have been? I think we are. I think that grief is one of the ways we honor the people that history found inconvenient to remember fully. James, the Lord's brother, the man who stayed, the pillar named first and inherited last, deserves, at minimum, that much from us. He stood in Jerusalem for 30 years. He prayed on stone floors until his knees became the record of it. He held something together that nothing else could hold once he was gone. 8 years after they killed him, the city he had given his life to was burning. Whether the connection between those two facts is history or something that lives in the space between history and meaning, I leave with you. The texts are there. The questions are open. James is waiting to be heard.